Hey everybody, it's Law from Slapdash Studios, D&D memes, and Dungeon Master of the League of Ultimate Questing, and I thought it would be fun to make a little bit of a tutorial video to show you guys how I make some of the maps that I print in my games that I play at home, or for the League of Ultimate Questing, or Orcs, which is kind of a D&D pop-up that I am involved with. And it's just a really easy way to make a not too big map. I use 11 by 17 for a lot of mine because they're very inexpensive to print at my local print shops. It's maybe like $1 or $2 for full color. I can laminate them pretty cheap, and I think it's a pretty good sized playing map. And if I want to make really big ones, I can lay them out side by side. There's other ways to make huge ones too, but what I'm going to do is just show you how to make a pretty straightforward 11 by 17 map for your games. And this isn't going to be sold or anything, it's just kind of for fun. So here's how I'm going to start. And I figured, like, I'll just kind of figure out what we're doing as we go. I thought we would make just like a nice grassy field with kind of like a stone cairn or some boulders of some kind, and like a little bit of a path leading through it. So what I have here is a 300 resolution 11 by 17 Photoshop file. And I've got a couple textures that I pulled up just to help us get a head start. So I've got a just a plain stone texture. I've got kind of a dirty, rocky texture, and then I've got this kind of high-res grass texture. What we're going to do is we're going to populate the file with these in layers, and I'm just going to drag it over. As you can see, the grass texture is much smaller. I don't want to transform it too much because it'll, you know, if you warp it up, it'll lose some of its quality. This one's pretty high res, so we can get away with a little bit of that, but I'm just going to leave it at kind of a medium size, get some mileage out of that, and I'm not going to transform it any more than that. I'm going to show you guys how to kind of use a texture to lay it out side by side as a pattern to fill up your space. And as you can see, as we're doing this, it's creating these kind of lines that are really awkward to look at visually. Like you can see, you can clearly make out the edges of the files. So we're going to flatten these all together so they're on the same layer. And taking a quick look here, there's super easy ways to do this. I'm just going to kind of clean it up a little bit. And I'm using a little bit of an older version of Photoshop, CS3. Haven't bought a new version in a while. And this one I just know really well. So we're using the healing brush here. And I'm just going to take a little sample. And you can see we can just kind of clean it up to hide where those lines are. And we can repeat this throughout the rest of the process. We're going to do the same thing with our dirt texture. And we're just going to hide those lines a little bit, make them not quite as visible. And if you're using, again, at a high res and you don't have the nicest computer, sometimes it'll take a minute. We're just going to finish that up real quick. So we've taken just a minute to kind of duplicate the grass texture and then heal it up a little bit so the lines aren't so obvious. And clearly there are ways to spend much longer doing this, putting a lot more work into it to fine-tune the tiny little details. We're not going to spend a long time because I just kind of want you guys to see how it works, at least how I do it. And there's other processes you can use that'll work even better. This is just a nice, easy way to knock one out. When we've done the same thing with our stone texture, so when you have a grass layer on top of a stone kind of dirt layer, and you can also look for images that are seamless, which will kind of automatically be generated in a way that they can be tiled out and not have obvious patterns in them. You can still do some cleanup on those too, but it'll save a little time if you want to go that way. I just kind of like these two, so they're the ones I went with. So what we're going to do now that we have our two textures kind of stretched out over the 11 by 17, filling up all the space, is we're going to adjust the colors. I'm going to go with sort of a, thinking like kind of a damp field, maybe like think of Scottish, rainy countryside. So we're going to look at some brightness and contrast. I'm going to turn the brightness down just a little bit, give it kind of that rich, lush, damp grass thing. And if you adjust the contrast, you're going to make those blades of grass pop out a ton more. It'll be kind of almost neon if you go too far up the line, which, you know, who knows, maybe that's what you want. Maybe in your world the grass is phosphorescent. We're just going to pull it up a little bit to make some kind of nice bright yellows pop out of the darker grass. That looks fine. I'm not going to spend too much on any of this. And we're going to do the same thing with our stone texture. We want this to look a little bit more muddy. So what we're going to do is bring out some of the reds. We're going to look at the color balance here. We're going to take those reds and just make them a little bit truer. Maybe pop out a little bit of yellow. We can do the same thing with our shadows, which is just going to highlight the darker parts of the image. So we're getting almost like a deserty sand color, which is okay, because we're going to take our brightness and go down a little bit, and now we're getting into this kind of like soft, damp earth with a little bit of the pebbles and texture still popping out. We can also adjust the contrast on that. I'm actually going to go down because this file has kind of large rocks. You know, it's a very close-up texture, and having a lower contrast will make those not quite as obvious. So we're going to look at those side by side. Not bad. I'm going to actually darken the dirt just a little bit more. Again, I'm just doing a very simple brightness reduction. So now we've got those, and what we want to do is we're going to make some stones, not necessarily like a perfectly geometric cairn, but just kind of like some boulders in a pattern. So what I've got here is just a nice stone texture, and we're going to do this super easy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my lasso tool, and I'm going to just highlight a few areas of it, kind of drawing the shape of roughly where I want my boulders or rocks to be. I'm going to go and modify my selection, and I'm going to feather it by just 2 pixels, which will just kind of soften up that border in case we have any like sharp edges from our lasso tool, because I'm just using a mouse and a keyboard. I'm not busting out my Wacom or doing anything fancy like that. And we're just going to put this on its own layer, so as we go, we're saving each of these rocks individually. So I'm going to go to layer and then via cut. And as you can see, you can just barely make out the outline of that rock that we just made. And I'm just going to draw a few more. So we've drawn just some really basic boulder shapes. Again, we're not going to use a brush or anything, just kind of making them look okay. So we've got these shapes, nothing too fancy. They all have a little bit of diversity to how they're designed, so they're not going to look super repetitive. And we're just going to drag these over one at a time onto this, make sure they're on top of the grass layer so they're actually visible. And we can also kind of transform them while they're here to get them to be roughly the size we're looking for. We can do all kinds of transforming if we want to skew them or make them look a little bit thinner. You can also, if you want to save a ton of time, just make one pretty interesting rock shape, and then you can really just warp it and kind of transform it up to make multiples that aren't quite as obvious if they're all the same file. Me, I just wanted to do some individual rocks. It only took us a minute. And I'm just going to kind of lay them out in a rough circular pattern. I want it to look like maybe this has been sitting for a long time and it's a little overgrown. And maybe it's so old that even when they had it, there wasn't a lot of quality put into it. We can just kind of space them out, whatever looks good. We want to make sure they're not too close together, because then we have a nice, wide open, diverse battlefield. But also a little bit of randomness to their placement. So that's looking okay. We're just going to make it look like that for now. And what we're going to do is I'm going to bring these all onto the same layer just by flattening them, so now all the rocks are there together. And as you can see, they're just really awkward shapes sitting on top of a nice grass texture. We can close that one over on the side so it's not distracting us. And what we're going to do is we're going to make them just fit a little more naturally onto our textured background. So I'm going to do a little bit of layer styling, and I'm going to bevel and emboss them. And how I'm going to set it is I'm going to go for an inner bevel that is smooth, and I'm going to go for a darkened shading. And I'm going to pick kind of a nice dark gray because they're stone. And what we can do is we can see as we adjust the size on this, it's going to make them sort of round out and pop up. But we're definitely going to want them to be very soft, so they don't look like they're cookie cutters. They're just kind of they've got a little bit of an edge to them. They curve. We can adjust the depth some more. And just kind of play with it, slide the bars around until we get to a spot that looks good to us. I'm going to turn the opacity down on both of these, being how dark and visual it is. Like basically it's the transparency of the layer, depending on what editing program you're using. Sometimes they will be called transparency. So that's looking okay. They just have a little bit of roundness to them. And again, we're not spending too long. We just kind of want to make them look okay. The color of them also kind of pops off the grass. It doesn't look very natural. So we're going to adjust our brightness, and we can adjust the contrast at this point too, which will also adjust the bevel that we put on there just a little bit. So that seems like a slightly more natural color for them. I might even bring out their greens just a tiny bit, which we can do by going to a color balance. So you see if we crank it up all the way, those will turn into actually like fish tank green stones. So we're just going to do it a teeny bit. I might even turn up the cyan just a little bit. Might be a little too blue. I always like to play with the sliders in case something surprisingly looks better than I would have thought, planning it ahead. So we're just to leave it like that. That's looking just fine. They don't pop off quite as dramatically, but they do have a little bit of depth to them. And then we're also going to give them a drop shadow. And I like to put them all on the same layer for this, so if I do any kind of angling or size editing on the shadows, it'll affect all of the stones at the same time. So as you can see, we can like make that real dark. We're not going to do that. But the spread is basically how far out from the object they go. Distance is like how they're centered, so I can make them all go to one side if we have a very specific way we want the sun to be facing on this map. We're just going to do a little bit of that, and I'm going to turn the opacity down so they're not incredibly dark. So those are looking okay. I'm happy with that. So we're going to create a layer on top of those, and the last thing I'm going to do to kind of add a little character to these rocks that I've generated is I'm going to make some kind of mossy, fun texture on top of them. So I'm going to take a green. I can actually pull it right off of the grass that I'm already using. I want something that's not too bright. I can even slide it around once I get something close. That looks pretty good. And we are now creating a new blank layer on top of the rocks. There are tons of ways you can do this. I'm just going to do the first one that makes sense to me. And we're going to use kind of this nice spacey brush, lots of feathering and little dots. We can make some random spots all around the rocks. We're just kind of eyeballing where we think some moss might be growing over them. Some of them can be mossier than others. I'm really feeling like Bob Ross the way I'm describing the moss on these rocks at this point. So that's not too crazy. That's okay. And as you can see, it's just this layer of green that's on top of the rocks right here. And that doesn't look really great how it is. So what we're going to do is we're going to select the negative space between the rocks, and then we're going to select the grassy layer that we just drew and delete all that extra stuff. And as you can see, we're already like showing a highlight from the shadows on the rocks underneath. And we're going to turn the opacity on the moss down, which will make it more transparent and really blend in with those shadows and things. So that's looking good to me. I like that. And the last little thing we're going to do is we're going to utilize our hidden dirt layer down here. And we're going to just reveal a little bit of like a path leading through it, maybe like a little bit of a clearing showing they've had a lot of, you know, foot traffic. So we're going to take an eraser. I'm going to grab kind of a similar, and I haven't downloaded any extra brushes on this version. I'm just using the really basic ones that came with it, so you're not going to have to worry about finding super neat, unique brushes, although I do encourage it. Having a nice collection of brushes is very useful. So we're going to get a nice big shape. We're going to edit our brush dynamics just a little bit right over here. So we're going to go to shape dynamics and we're going to increase the jitter and the diameter. And we're just going to kind of make it randomize the shape that it's dropping every time we generate a brush stroke, just so that we have kind of a nice natural look to it. And again, this is an eraser tool, so we're not drawing anything. What we're doing is we're subtracting from the grass. So we've got our grass layer selected. I'm going to turn the opacity down to, let's say roughly 40%. And this is my favorite part because I think it always looks really nice. We're just going to start carving away light clicks on the grass to reveal some of that dirt that's underneath. And just kind of eyeballing what we think like a nice little path leading through might be. It's obviously overgrown. We can have some spots like near the base of the rocks have a little more of that dirt showing up. And maybe just throw in a couple little ones over here to show that people have been all over the place. And that looks really nice. And as you can see, what we did was we just eliminated some visuals of the grass to reveal the rocks underneath. And since the opacity on the brush is way down, it has a nice soft reveal. It's not a hard line. So there's little bits of grass everywhere. And that's pretty cool. I'm a big fan of that. And the last thing I'm going to do is I always have, for my 11x17s, I just have a transparent grid that I can drop over the top. I like to use a grid. And if we zoom in, we can see that it's really just a straightforward black line on top of this stuff. It kind of pops off a little bit, but in order to make it, you know, visually match the tone of the picture and not be too obvious and geometric, we can add like a very soft drop shadow. And actually we can really zoom in on what's going on here to really see what's happening up close. So we'll try that again. So we have our drop shadow. We're going to take the opacity down quite a bit. We're going to increase the spread And you can see the distance is what's kind of making it off-kilter from the rest of the grid, so we're going to make that as 0 so it lines up perfectly. Increase the size, so it just kind of has a soft shadow to it. You make that opacity just a little bit lighter, and this will just sort of visually blend it with what's going on around it, give them a little bit of depth. And then we'll take the layer opacity and turn it down just a bit. So it's nice and visual, but not like painfully awful to look at. You can see it on top of the grass texture. And yeah, I think that looks nice. It's nothing too fancy. It only took us maybe 10-15 minutes to knock it out. And obviously that was not putting a lot of work into it. If you have a very special map that you want to generate for your game, you can't find it online, I encourage doing this. You can buy textures online. You can find some that are used for free. A lot of these textures are found for 3D modeling and things like that. I have just an arsenal that I've collected over the years that I like to pull from, and if you're interested in doing this, I suggest kind of doing the same. If you have any questions about how we do this kind of stuff, or you want to learn more little tips and stuff, you're welcome to follow us on Twitter for Slapdash Studios. It's at slap_the_dash. You can visit us at slap-studios.com, or you can reach out to D&D Memes, where I will also probably be sharing this just for fun and getting some fun information out to the world. And listen to the League of Ultimate Questing. It's a lot of fun. We're getting some really good reviews, which I appreciate very much. And if you want to reach out to ask questions about DMing or how the characters are played by the players, world lore, anything like that, we'd love to hear from you. So thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you guys next time.
It's the League of Ultimate Questing! Find out more at slap-studios.com.